Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. Today we're going to talk about the Broken Skull sessions featuring Becky Lynch. And as usual, I like to talk about these Broken Skull sessions because there's usually some pretty good information in it. Not just the history of the wrestler, but also a pretty good central theme that usually I can pull out of it. Even it might not even be said, but it's a general theme that you see in the episode. In this episode, it was a focus on identity, finding yourself, finding out who you are, and what you want to do out of life. This was I think Becky Lynch was a great story in people being lost, especially young people, and not necessarily knowing what they want to do with themselves, and kind of going through a crisis at an early age where you expect success very young, and then it doesn't come, and then you kind of give up. And then you wish you hadn't gone back to it, or you wish you had never given up on it. And sometimes you double back. And sometimes you just live in the land of what if. Becky Lynch did not live in the land of what if. She actually went back. So let's put all this into its appropriate context. So looking at her biography. So she said she started wrestling in 2002 at 15 years old. She was all about moves. All she cared about was the moves. So she was learning how to wrestle. And she started talking about, nobody wants to see 20 minutes of wrist locks. And she learned over time to focus on story. And she says, like, in the early days, she was in high school, I believe. She needed to get her life together. She was supposed to take a CERT test as something in Ireland. It's kind of like, I think the United States kind of has one similar, where it's kind of like a test for I think maybe colleges, universities, stuff like that. It's kind of tell you where you're going to go in life or that kind of thing. And she thought it was so important, and she was kind of stressed out over it. But she was 15 at the time. And then she says and admits that she was drinking too much, and that, studying for these exams and being under such pressure, it made her want to have a beer. And so it was a very interesting thing that she's like kind of a young alcoholic. So she said she heard that Fergal Devitt, who we know as Finn Balor, was opening a wrestling school not far from her. And she said she had been watching Tough Enough and kind of had the idea that it was going to be like these big monstrous guys in this wrestling school, because that's what she thought all wrestlers looked like. Turns out there was a bunch of skinny kids like her trying to learn how to wrestle. So then she says at 18, she basically left home and went to Canada, where she wrestled there with little to no money. And she talked about how she made her first paid gig in France. She made €50. She made $30 to $50 in Canada, and that she could withstand the pain. So she knew that that wasn't a problem, but she wasn't very good, and she knew she wasn't very good. She knew she was awful, but she was still trying. She was giving it the old college try. And then her brother got into wrestling. And her brother was kind of a natural. And so she kind of started working out with him, training with him. And she actually got a little bit better. And then in Germany, she was wrestling an opponent. She said an inexperienced opponent who wasn't very good. And she had been traveling around for a little while, so she thought she knew something. She had been to Japan, I believe, at this point. And she tried to suplex the opponent and dropped the opponent on her own head. So, and she talked about basically getting a serious concussion from this. And she talked about how the crowd started chanting women's wrestling at her. And she said, like, unlike today, when they chanted women's wrestling at you in the past, it was basically talking about this is a lower quality wrestling. And so she got a serious concussion. She was really injured. She was very young. And then she used her head injury as a kind of a way to quit. That, she saw no vision for the future. And she told herself if she wasn't going to be a success by 20, she was going to go off and do something else. And she had told her mom she was going to go to Canada and work for a year, and then she would go back to college. So the head injury gave her an opportunity to basically leave the business for a little while. So she set up bodybuilding. She went into that. She started getting eating disorders, and from the bodybuilding, which I'm guessing it was probably self-image issues. And she said she was supposed to go to Orlando to do some wrestling stuff. And while she was in the airport, she basically had a nervous breakdown. And she called her mom and asked her mom, if she could come home, and her mom said no. You kind of put yourself in this situation. You gotta see it through. But she refused to continue. So she was depressed, going through all of these other problems like the eating disorders and the drinking and everything, and she just decided to quit. So and everybody knows about the 7-year gap that Becky Lynch took. So during that 7 years, she became a flight attendant. She taught English. She became a personal trainer, and she studied acting in college and took up jobs as being a stunt woman in a TV show called The Vikings. So, but she said a voice in her mind kept telling her to continue, kept telling her to go back to wrestling, something that she really wanted to do. But let's pause right here. Like, you see that this is a very interesting story. That you have a young person, she's like 18, 19 years old, and she's putting a tremendous amount of pressure on herself to be a success almost immediately. To the point where she wanted to try to prove herself in front of an audience and ended up hurting herself in the process, and using the injury as a way to basically quit the business because she wasn't becoming a success as quickly as she thought she could be. And then during that time, she still didn't have any ideas. She was going to college and she worked as a flight attendant and she was a teacher, personal trainer. Like, all of these are completely different. None of these things are even related. Like, none of this stuff is even related. So she's kind of flitting back and forth in all of these different industries because she doesn't know what she wants to do. But she kept saying about this gnawing voice in the back of her mind that made her, push and push. And then she eventually saw Devitt in Japan becoming a big success. And she said she kind of got jealous of him. So she went to talk to him. And he told her, you need to get back into it because I don't want to have this conversation with you again in 10 years of what could have been. So she said she took a wrestling class while she was working on a TV show. And she was suggested that she goes back to WWE and give her the tryout. So this has led her to NXT. So she talked about NXT being a very difficult, very awful experience for her because she had taken off for 7 years. And she had become a bit of a reputation for having some pretty good women's matches. And her name kind of mattered in the independent wrestling space. So she was under a lot of pressure in NXT. And she said she was too focused on the wrestling. She didn't want anybody to think that she was good because she had been out of the business for 7 years. And, word travels. And she said she knew Paige, who was still there. And Sarah Del Rey, who was the coach. She actually wrestled Sarah Del Rey in Japan. So there was going to be high expectations. And so she was concerned that the expectations might be too high, considering she quit the business for 7 years and was, as she said, back in the physical shape that she was when she first started at 15. So she lost 7 years of her career, which means that, 7 years of athleticism had kind of gone back. She wasn't using the skills that she had. So she was rusty. And so she was concerned about people hearing that she was so good. So she kind of was trying to keep her head down, trying to stay quiet. But she also didn't want people to think that she had an ego. And she kept saying, like, I was trying to make sure that I was, not getting too big for my britches. And so then she started talking about, what also made NXT so awful for her is that there were so many can'ts, that there was so many rules on the women that they can't punch. They can't do a bunch of other things. When she first started in NXT, and of course, all those sorts of things started to die down over time. And then she said she had no idea about costuming, how to dress. So she didn't know anything about, how she should, her appearance, how she should bring herself out, what kind of image she wanted to portray. She talked about how all the other women were beautiful and they were athletic, and she started to feel a little bit out of her depth. And she said that, to a degree, she was humble, but she was a little too humble because she was scared to do anything. She was scared to really engage and to really get involved. And she said she felt every moment that she was on the verge of getting fired. And so she went to Bill DeMott and she said to him, I have a connection with the audience. I need you to just give me a chance. Please just give me a chance. And Bill DeMott gave her the opportunity. And, I guess this is what led to her being the Irish river dancer on television or some such nonsense. So she talked about when Austin asked her about her connection with the audience. And she says that, it's an energetic exchange and people feel her energy. And that she likes people and she likes performing. She also talked about the Four Horsewomen, how the other three were very nice to her, but even though there were other people in NXT that were not. They talked about Charlotte, but we'll get into that later. She said that she felt like the afterthought of the Four Horsewomen because she focused on storytelling and she wasn't, the best looking. She wasn't the most athletic. She didn't have the cleanest kind of matches, but she felt she connected with the audience because she was the most genuine. And she said for her, it was more the old adage, if you don't believe in yourself, the audience won't believe in you either. And then he talked about WrestleMania. I believe this is 34, where it was Sasha, Charlotte, and Becky in a triple threat match. And she says that she felt overlooked after that match because the company has a thing about pushing one woman at a time, and it was the one woman with the belt, and it wasn't her. But then they had the SmackDown belt. I guess what was a couple of weeks later they did the Backlash thing, and she ended up becoming the first SmackDown Women's Champion. And she says that it meant the world to her because she had worked very hard to get there, and felt that she still wasn't very good, and that she should have been fired, but she was scared of losing wrestling, and she was really holding a death grip onto wrestling, and she still felt that she wasn't getting the push. Even though she had the belt, she didn't really get the push that she felt she deserved. And she says that as a babyface, once you get to the top, where do you go? And I think this is a very important question. Once you're at the top as a babyface, what's your next goal? And she talks about a conversation she had with John Cena. And it's very interesting because Apollo Crews apparently had this same conversation with John Cena. And she asked John Cena for some advice about where to go, what to do next. Because she was, I think after her SmackDown Women's title run, she was on TV, off TV, on TV, off TV. That kind of thing WWE does to people. And John Cena said, well, I don't know who you are. And she thought that he was talking about he didn't know her name. And so she was like, don't you know who I am? I'm Becky Lynch. And John Cena was like, I'm the Irish Lass Kicker. And Cena was like, I don't know what that is. What is that? And she starts talking about the steampunk look and all this sort of stuff. She said, but basically there was no meaning behind it. She just did the steampunk thing to stand out. There was no connection between her look and what she said and what she did. There was no identity there. And so she was having a difficult time. And that's what leads to you floundering. So I think this is another good spot to stop and talk about it, because that's a very interesting position too. We've seen tons of wrestlers get, put on TV and then snatched off TV. They get repackaged again and again because whatever they're doing doesn't work. And sometimes it's more of them needs to come out. Sometimes less of them needs to come out, depending on the situation. But the old adage of who are you? The Cena question. What's your character? What's your motivations? Who are you? And an inability to answer that question. This is something that I probably saw Al Snow talk about, where Al Snow says that you need to be able to explain to people who you are in 3 sentences or something like that. And that was very interesting. I always liked that. Because, and sometimes it would be interesting to do a challenge like that. Like, can you describe a wrestler that is super over in 3 sentences or less? Can you really tell people, inform people who this character is and what this character is about in 3 sentences? And that's a strong statement. And I really thought about it. And you could form that in the way of identity. Because you could take somebody like Ric Flair. What is Ric Flair? Kiss stealing, wheeling dealing, limousine riding, jet flying. That says it all right there. And that's basically 1 sentence. Like that's 1 sentence. Because those are all commas. Limousine riding, comma. Jet flying, comma. You know, that's all one sentence. So that was the challenge. Is she had to try to define the last kicker. Who is the last kicker? What does that mean? You know, you could, if you wanted to break it down, you could say last is, that's what they call girls in Ireland. So that tells you that she's Irish. And last kicker would be, it's kind of a little bit of a play on words like ass kicker, like she's a badass. But you didn't really get that from the look. You got that she was basically doing some type of Comic Con cosplay thing where you see a bunch of steampunk people all the time. And so you kind of you get an idea of what the last kicker is, but you don't really see it in the presentation or anything like that. There's a disconnect there. And so then SummerSlam 2018, she felt like she was in the spot and was ready to get the title back. She was supposed to be wrestling Carmella. The company then shoes in Charlotte, and Charlotte wins the belt. And this is what leads to Becky's heel turn and her infamous promo where she talked about that this match was supposed to be about her and that she felt like an afterthought and that she's not going to dwell in opinions anymore. She's going to be about all action. And she felt, the crowd was reacting positively because it was finally coming out that she was a badass, that she was not going to take any more shit. She was no longer going to play second fiddle to Charlotte. This is what, kind of brought the personality out of her. It put a chip on her shoulder. They're starting to really recognize now who the last kicker really is, what the last kicker really is. And the exclamation put on that promo is that Charlotte had been holding her back, her best friend, right? So, and she said that the promo was fueled by the constant pushing and pulling of her character, putting her on TV and then pulling her off, putting her on TV and pulling her off. And she debated with the office about it because she thought that, the office thought that she would get booed, but she knew that she would get cheered. She knew that, people were kind of turning on Charlotte. This was 3 years ago, by the way, that people were kind of starting to turn on Charlotte. And, she didn't want to heel on the crowd, but she, played the game, did it, healed on the crowd a little bit. But she says that at this point is when she stopped thinking so much about spots and moves and started thinking more about, the storytelling. That she no longer held so much emphasis on spots and moves. So her and Steve Austin talk about the power of the promo, where she talked about once she was given the opportunity to speak from the heart, she was able to really mold her promo style and was able to get over. So now we got, as far as the identity is concerned, we're starting to form it in her promos, who she is and what she is. So now we need the look. The look needs to match the attitude that they're coming up with. And she said she consulted with Vince, and it was all about opportunities. And she was always cutting promos backstage. She do social media interviews, and she was constantly thinking about promos. And the interesting thing here is she has so much freedom that she actually comes up with a lot of her own material. And she said it here that sometimes she, writes her own promos in the notes page of her phone. And it's almost like writing, and Austin said it was kind of like writing a song, right? And she was like, yeah, sometimes things come into your mind and you write it down. You don't always have a pencil and a piece of paper. She used to put it in the notes page of her phone. So then we finally get to putting an image with this character that she's forming. And this is when Nia Jax broke her face, right? And she talked about, being concussed, being on autopilot after this, and the blood smearing all over her face. She goes up into the crowd and she kind of does the pose with her arms out. And that became sort of an iconic image. That image put a face on the gimmick that she started at SummerSlam. It sort of encapsulated what she was doing. So then, of course, Steve Austin asked, when was the man born? And she says that, it was between her and a friend. They were sending text messages to each other. And she would always just say, "You're the man, man." And the person would say it back, "You're the man." And then so she kind of put it up on Instagram. And, fans kind of just attached themselves to it. So that's where the man came from. It wasn't like they kind of openly stole it from Ric Flair. Then she says that John Cena approached her and said afterwards, like, I know who you are now. You're the man. You know? And that kind of, everything kind of made sense from there. She knew what the character would say. She knew what the character looked like. The image tells you what the character is. It all began to come together. And it was interesting because she said that, you know, Nia Jax sent her some flowers after she gave her a concussion. But she said, I should have sent her flowers because, you know, it was probably one of the most important things that ever happened to me. And who knows where I would be if Nia Jax hadn't been heavy-handed and busted my face. So, of course, they talked about her issues with Ronda Rousey. And this was a very interesting thing, too, about when she started her feud with Ronda Rousey, that people were on her side, not Ronda's side. And she broke it down like this. She's like, I'm an everyman. You know, even though she's not a man, she's an everyman. She's an average Joe. And Ronda Rousey is not easy for people to connect with because Ronda Rousey is a natural born athlete. She's an Olympian, UFC champion. She's always been in a different stratosphere as far as somebody that people can never be. She's a superhero, essentially. While I am a normal person, you know, I go through things. I go up, I go down. I have flaws. I have, you know, different kind of stuff like this. Also, a lot more genuine outside of the manufactured image of Ronda Rousey. Now, she didn't say that Ronda Rousey's image was manufactured. I'm saying that because I know that it was. I looked at the UFC and watched them do it. All right. I watched the UFC put all that shit together. You know, Ronda Rousey being in movies, Ronda Rousey doing commercials, all that stuff with UFC because she was the golden girl. That whole thing was formed by Dana White. You know, Vince is just trying to cash in on it. While, you know, Becky Lynch is a little bit more different. She's a little bit more grounded. And she felt like that was the story going into WrestleMania. But then, of course, it was, you know, they shoehorned Charlotte into the match. And she says that going into WrestleMania, she really wanted to focus on getting people to care about her, not only to get to the point of being the main event of WrestleMania, which she really, really, really wanted to be, but also caring about her after WrestleMania. So that was very interesting, too, when she talked about her dad was there, and her brother was there, but her mom never made it. And she said, you know, the crowd was pretty much dead because the show was so long. She kind of joked that the show was 9 hours long. But I don't know how long that show was, but that show was long as hell. And that match was whack. And Steve Austin asked her, like, okay, you had this, you here, you got both belts now. Becky 2 belts. Where did that come from? And then she says that was another thing that her and a friend came up with, was the whole Becky 2 belts thing. So she said, you know, what was next was media at 5 a.m. You know, after, you know, getting into bed about 12 o'clock, you got to get up and do media all over again. So then she says that it became about maintaining her momentum. And this is another interesting piece right here, because she talked about wrestling Lacey Evans, and Steve Austin basically said that wasn't her job, because she said, like, you know, her job at this point was to build new contenders. Now, they started this conversation talking about, you know, not just her motherhood, but also her wrestling Liv Morgan. And Steve Austin basically saying, like, you building your contenders is not your job. You're the top star. They should be building the contenders for you, which is absolutely the right thing. Either one of them is wrong in that assertion, you know, but sometimes the booking and the creative are not strong enough, and therefore you have to lend them a hand. And she says that it's always a delicate balance of her having to lift people to her level, because she doesn't want to get too big for her britches. That's another interesting time when she used that statement. Is, you know, she didn't want to feel like she got a super ego, so she doesn't mind. And later in the episode, she says, you know, it was nice to be the first to do a lot of these things, but I don't want to be the last. So when you look at it from that perspective, even though it's not her job to build her contenders like Lacey Evans or Liv Morgan or any of the Doudrop, she still participates because she doesn't want to be on that hill by herself because she can't be there forever, you know? So it's an interesting, and she talked about it being a delicate balance, you know? So that was all very nice too. And it also talks about her identity. As I said about, being in this position, she's in rarefied air where most women have never been. So how does she play this game? It's a different game. And she talked about TJ Wilson helping with a lot of the women's matches and stuff like that. And she actually pitched to lose to Shayna Baszler at WrestleMania 36 because being champion for a long time is very difficult as a babyface. But of course, she got overruled on that. Then they took time to talk about her pregnancy. And early in the episode, they also talked about her motherhood, which is just another aspect of her identity, is something else that she's adding to her character and to her persona and personality. And this is where she said that wrestling isn't her life anymore. And this made wrestling easier for her because she now has something else other than wrestling. And she has a family, she got a baby. So now it's not wrestling. And that allows her to put on Becky Lynch and then take Becky Lynch off. It allows her to create that separation between her and the character where she now can go out there and treat wrestling like it's fun. And, the real work is being a mom. So, of course, Steve Austin talked about, when she was scared of losing her spot when she was out pregnant. And it said, of course, but she also wanted to be gone because she wanted to get that huge pop when she came back. So that was very interesting too. So then he also talked about SummerSlam 2021 when she jobbed out Bianca Belair. And Becky says, look, the company wanted me to be a heel. And they said, if we go out there and have a really long match, it would not have created the sympathy for Bianca that we wanted. So the better way to create sympathy for her was to beat her in short order with a cheap shot and all that kind of stuff, which makes perfect sense. And you really can't argue with that. But she says that she also didn't know that she was going to be in the match. So there was no time to go over a match anyway. So she was called pretty much at the last minute. I'm guessing the whole thing with Sasha Banks was not 100% apparent to them, even though it should have been. Then she talked about changing the character and that she stopped calling herself the Man because she wanted to strip away all of the things that the people liked about her, like the Man and the black jacket and all that kind of stuff, the simple shirt, the man shirt. She wanted to get rid of all of that. And that's where Big Time Bex came from, to turn her into a more arrogant character. So this is about changing your persona, right? You have an identity, it's kind of set. It's been a success. It works. But now it's time to change. It's time to grow. It's time to go to a different level. And it's also in a position where you can't be the Man forever. You've been the Man for 2 or 3 years. It kind of had run its course. Now she's doing something different, doing something else. So I like that. It's just, constantly adapting, trying to adapt the character to different times and a different WWE, because now there's different people on the roster. So they spent some time talking about her relationship with Charlotte, where basically she broke down what was supposed to happen in the title swap scene. We've been over that 100 times. Basically, Charlotte was supposed to give her the belt. She was going to put the belts up, be Becky 2 belts. Charlotte was going to ask her, hey, if you want to fight me right now. She was supposed to back down and then give Charlotte her belt back or give her the other belt. But apparently Charlotte didn't like that and threw the belt down, all that kind of stuff. But she says that maybe when they're not in the business anymore, they can become friends again. But right now, the business is too competitive and they don't get along. That was essentially the long and the short of it. So that was kind of the whole of the Becky Lynch Broken Skull sessions right there. It was an interesting episode and I enjoyed listening to her story. There's obviously some things we could have gone deeper into, but they have to spend more time on, the motherhood and that kind of stuff, which is only mildly interesting to me. But I did enjoy listening to her struggles. Her trying to figure out who she wanted to be and what she wanted to be and when and where and how, and doing it from a young age. Finding yourself is something very important for young people, you know? So I think if people pull that lesson from this episode, that's probably the best thing that you could have pulled from it. Is that you see somebody who's, by most people's merits and accounts, a success, you know, and it wasn't always that way. Obviously, you don't know how the sausage is made. So she's telling you, hey, look at how hard it was for me. Somebody that everybody looks up to, this was very hard. This was very difficult. And I started at 15 and I didn't get where I wanted to be until I was almost 30, until I was in my 30s, actually. So it's incredible. It's a great lesson that especially young people who do stupid things when they were young, it's a good thing that they can learn, you know? And I wouldn't put her in the same category as MVP and Booker T as far as inspirational stories that, young people should look at and say to themselves, man, I could do that. If they could do it, I could do it too. I think that's a different level. When you lose years of your life to prison, that's a little bit different than you kind of giving up on a dream and then deciding, you know what, giving up was wrong, and you jump back into it. It's a little bit different, but she still is pretty inspirational for young people who don't have such a severe backstory, such as, hey, I went to prison. MVP is perfect for that story. Booker T is perfect for that story. But for somebody who is floating through life, you're not doing anything criminal, but you're spending most of your time playing video games and you have no dedication, you have no focus. I think a Becky Lynch type story could really help you, because it's all about following your dreams and also knowing who you are and who you want to be and going out and getting it. So I think that I like that. It was a good inspirational story. All right. Like this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel, donate to the channel. Thank you guys for your time. I'll talk to you guys later, man. Peace.